Next up, television presenter, farmer, and writer Kate Humble talks to Julia Wheeler about her new book, A Year of Living Simply. Her book questions whether we need to take a step back, reprioritise, and just make our lives more simple. With regards to travel, where can we find this simplicity? How can we bring it home with us and incorporate this way of living into our everyday lives? Now, if you'd like to ask Kate any questions, please feel free to post them in the live chat box, and Julia will put as many questions as possible to Kate during the session.
Hello, and let me add my very warm welcome to the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival and the Destinations Show. Thanks so much for being here, particularly for this conversation, but I'm sure many of you have been enjoying this all weekend, and you should know that this is continuing. Do tell your friends to come back to the website to have a look and to enjoy what you've been enjoying. My name is Julia Wheeler, and it's my huge pleasure to welcome an author who is also one of the UK's best known television presenters. You have the chance to ask her questions, so do please get those into the chat as you think of them as we're going through, because Kate and I are going to weave those into our conversation. So, Kate Humble is a farmer, a conservationist, and an entrepreneur, as well as being someone who appears on our screens and who writes books. It's a busy old life. But in her latest book, she takes a step back, giving herself a year of living simply and looking at the joys of a life less complicated. Kate, welcome to Stanfords. Welcome to Destinations.
Lovely, thank you. It's so nice to be here. I wish we were all together, but this is not bad.
No, absolutely. And great that so many people can tune in on a Sunday afternoon and that it can be there afterwards. Now, I get the impression that this idea of living simply is something that's been brewing with you for a pretty long time. And I wonder if you can sort of trace back, a decade or more now, to your move from the city to the country as being perhaps the start of that.
Yeah, I think it's one of those sort of unconscious things in a way. I moved from London to Wales about 13 years ago now, coming up for 14 years, amazingly. And it wasn't one of those sort of city slicker. I'm going to move to the countryside and abandon my Jimmy Choos for my wellies sort of moves. I was a country girl who didn't do terribly well in the city, so I was kind of coming back to my muddy roots, if you like. And yes, perhaps you've picked up on something that I hadn't, which was maybe that was a point where I'd got to an age where the appeal of being outdoors more, of having space to grow vegetables, of just living a life that didn't involve kind of shopping and being on the tube seemed much more appealing. And perhaps that realization did grow. I mean, the idea of, a year of living simply, it wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to start in January and I'm going to end in December and that will be my year and then I'll go back to normal. As you say, it was something that kind of happened over a gradual length of time but took on an urgency. And it may have been, I'm not, to be honest, I'm not quite sure what it was that kind of drove that consciousness, that drove that feeling of, I really need to do this. But I suspect it was a combination of things. I think a combination of getting older, that boring thing that we're all doing. And when you get to your late 40s and your early 50s, you have some quite stark reminders of life being finite. You get to an age where, your parents start being unwell or you lose your parents. And that really makes you reprioritize. That really makes you think, what is important? What essentially is it about life that makes me happy? And I think that was the nub of it, was that exploration of what made me feel content and what made me feel happy, and the realization that it wasn't buying things, it wasn't material things, it was carving out time in my life to do things that give you little bursts of joy and satisfaction, whether it's making, in my case, some quite bad bread initially. I've killed so many sourdough starters, you don't even want to think about it. If there was a cruelty group for sourdough, I would have been prosecuted a long time ago. But or growing something. But I think it was just that it was a search for small joys, and weirdly, it started before lockdown. I mean, the book came out at the beginning of I delivered the book. I delivered the manuscript at the end of January last year. So before any of us were really aware of the pandemic and how it was going to affect us. But it was very odd, I suppose, that a lot of the things that I'd written about and a lot of the things that I'd found comfort from and solace in were many of the things then that when we were locked down, when we were in that first initial state of confusion and being quite scared, that we turned to. Lots of us did turn to growing things and baking things and creating. And yeah, I think oddly what I tapped into was just a little survival mechanism that many of us share.
Fantastically prescient, really. And I wonder whether, I mean, you've made the move, and in your TV programs, in one of the TV programs, A Country Life for Half the Price, you help other people make those moves. Have the number of applications gone through the roof for that program, for being featured and having you help people, given what we've been through the last year?
It's certainly, the last year has certainly focused people's minds. I mean, we're actually filming a new series at the moment, and we're following. We followed 6 families in the first series, and again that went out right at the beginning of lockdown, just again purely by chance, I think, and did tap into I think some sort of national psyche of people going, oh my goodness, if they had been thinking about that, if they had had those dreams of kind of moving to the countryside, suddenly they had been thrown into very, very sharp focus by what was going on. And certainly a number of the families that we're filming for this series, most of them, I think, had been dreaming of a move for a long time and planning and searching. You don't just find your kind of dream country house in an instant. For some people, it's taken years and years and years. But again, I think the pandemic was very much the kind of the kick, the boost that made them say, let's just get on with it. And I'd like to think that it's not just the sort of idea of moving to the countryside and living a dream, that actually, I don't know quite how to differentiate this, but it's almost that there is such a lifestyle choice in that. It is a very different way of living. And I think there are echoes, again, of the things that I explored in the book that people are now searching for. It is that reprioritizing. It is that thinking. So many of the families that I've talked to have made this move primarily for their children. They want their children to have space. They want their children to have contact with the countryside. They want their children to have filthy fingernails like mine. Sorry, everybody. They want them to be able to have a much more natural and simple childhood. They want them to be able to climb trees, and to hell with the health and safety. They want them to have that sense of independence that you can have when you've got more space around you, and safety. I think people are really thinking, we want to be away from crowded urban areas. And yes, so certainly the pandemic has had a noticeable effect on people wanting to move. And outside our series, I know I know from people cursing me, saying, "Oh, now everyone wants to move to the country." I said, well, it's not entirely my fault to say, but it has meant that demand for places in the country has gone through the roof, and you hear stories of, a house going on the market and literally estate agents being kind of inundated, bribed, anything for people to be able to get those houses.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was talking to some people yesterday actually who were saying that in the area that I live in, things are going to sealed bids. So it has
Yes.
just gone absolutely crazy. Yeah, we blame you, Kate Humble. Um, so you
Sorry about that.
talked about some of the reasons that people go, and I think many of us might think that we'd like a simpler life, but what are the obstacles, both on that big scale, if you're thinking of changing your whole life, but also just on a day-to-day scale? What do you think, what have you explored in the book that you found um, prevented you or just put obstacles in your way to achieving what you set out to do?
Well, I think I need to be clear here that because I was when I sort of came up with this idea, and it was very woolly, and I was talking to Stephanie, my lovely publisher, about it, and I said, look, this, I've had this sort of idea, and it's been brewing for a while, and she said, well, you're not going to go and live in a cave, are you, and expect people to bring you gruel? And I said, no, 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 that really isn't the idea. And I think that's something that actually does prevent people kind of taking on the simple life, thinking that they have to make a monumental, fundamental change to the way that they live. And actually, what I discovered by being more conscious of wanting to, as I say, carve out time, incorporate these sort of more simple elements into my life, was that it was actually a very gentle change of habit that was required. It wasn't cataclysmic. I didn't suddenly have to just wear rags and go and live in a cave. That simplicity could be incorporated into normal life. And in fact, I think a lot of people, although no one would have chosen a pandemic to demonstrate this, I think a lot of people have realised that it is quite easy to give yourself a little bit of time to grow a few veg, even if it's or flowers in pots on a windowsill, and the enormous pleasure, I think anyway, you get from doing something like that far outweighs the pleasure that you might have got by going to a shopping mall. So don't go to a shopping mall, plant something instead. And so I think we all get into habits. I mean, I do work ridiculously hard, and there are times where I just think, here am I, talking about simplicity, and I've just worked a 16-hour day, and I haven't got time to take my dog for a walk, and that drives me crazy. But as I say, it isn't. It doesn't require an enormous life change. It doesn't require moving to the depths of Wales or anywhere. You can live simply anywhere. It is, as I say, a case of just shifting your priorities and perhaps doing what your heart really desires rather than what you think you should be doing or other people think you should be doing.
It's also about redefining success, isn't it? And you tell the story in the book of a woman called Kathy who was a successful advertising executive, and how she went about. She had to change her life, but how she relabeled things, turned things around.
Yeah, I mean, Kathy Slack's story, I think, is amazing. So, and I didn't know her story. So, Kathy is a food writer and a blogger. She has a blog called Gluts and Gluttony, and I was aware of her. We knew a few people in common. I'd met her at a couple of sort of food festivals, that kind of thing, and I love her blog. And one of the things that people may recognise if they start growing things, growing veg, is that some fail completely. I am rubbish at growing tomatoes, it turns out, but I'm really good at growing chilies. And I had this glut of chilies, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with them? You know, what do any of us do when we're starting on this journey of learning how to grow things with these gluts? So I thought, well, I know, I'm going to contact Kathy and see if she's got any ideas. And she said, yeah, come to my kitchen in the Cotswolds and bring some chilies, and we'll do some stuff with them. And just sort of by the by, while we were sitting and drinking coffee and eating her amazing sugar-free banana bread, which the recipe, I said, please give me the recipe so I can put it in the book. It's there. I said, so how did you get into this? Did you always grow vegetables? And she was like, no. And she told me this story. So as you said, Julia, she was this a very high-flying advertising executive, working crazy hours, traveling all the time. And so many of us, I mean, obviously, this is the Destinations Travel Show. We love traveling, but traveling the way that she was traveling, you know, just going from hotel to hotel in different cities, never actually seeing anything, never really experiencing where she was going. That's very soulless sort of travel. So she's just said, I was permanently exhausted and jet lagged and never really wanted to go to another airport ever. But as you said, she was very successful. Everybody looked at her and said, there is a woman at the top of her game. She was earning a huge salary and she was enormously respected within the industry. And then one morning, she was amazingly at home. She got up and got into her shower, her familiar shower that she got into every day that she was at home, and looked at the tap and thought, I don't know how to work it. And she just couldn't, something had happened. And then she got in her car and she looked at her car key and she knew that the car key was needed for something, but she couldn't quite work out what it was. And basically, she said to me, she said, Kate, I thought I'd had a stroke. And what had happened is that she'd had a cataclysmic breakdown, and it had come from just the stress and overwork and just the sort of ridiculous schedule that she had put herself through over the years. And she was signed off. Her company that she was working for were amazing. She said they gave me huge support. She was signed off for 4 months. And I recognize this because I think many of us will recognize this. She went into a panic. She's like, but that's my identity gone. You know, my whole life and everything that I am is wrapped up in my professional persona. And if I don't have that anymore, who am I? Where do I belong? What do I do? How does my day, what is the shape of my day? And for quite a long time, the shape of her day was just being in bed. She couldn't even get out of bed. But the times that she could, she found that she would just head unconsciously into her garden and start kind of mucking around in the soil. And she thought, maybe I'll just grow some stuff. She'd never had time to do this before. And she planted a few seeds and some of them didn't come up, but some of them did. And that, when you're in that frame of mind, when you are so broken, to see a green shoot poking through the soil that you are responsible for feels like a miracle. And after 4 months, she was able to go back to work. She went back for a week and then she realized that actually she couldn't do this anymore. And she had to just accept that she had to reinvent herself and that somehow it was going to involve growing. That was what she wanted to do. And she phoned a local producer who lived down the road and said, can I come and work for you for the summer? I don't know anything. And they said, come on. And she took a 90% pay drop, she told me. But she also says, and looking at her now, anyone, if you're on your computers, you know, Google Kathy, she is the most glowing, healthy, wonderful looking woman you've ever seen. And she said, I have never been happier, never been happier. And her first book comes out in June, her first cookery book comes out in June. And she just hasn't looked back. And she said, you know, it did take a huge mental breakdown to make me change my career. And I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but it did me the greatest favor. So I suppose her lesson to all of us is, you know, maybe if you have an inkling, do it before your body tells you that you don't know how to work your shower.
There's so many really life-affirming stories in your book, actually, and we'll come on to some more of those in a moment. But there are some questions coming in. Hello, Kate. As a grandparent and lady of a certain age, I remember the time before the internet when life was so much simpler. Lockdown meant a reliance on technology for a lot more people. So how do we now educate our children to take time away from their screens and live a more relaxing, simpler life?
Gosh, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be running the world. You are absolutely. Do we know this nice lady's name of a certain age?
No.
No name. Hello, no name, lovely lady. It is going to be a tricky one. But funnily enough, I was filming with one of our country life families yesterday, and their daughter had spent quite a lot of time during lockdown, like many children, as you said, on her screen, communicating with her friends. And actually, let's not knock that, because lockdown for a lot of people, particularly young people, was very, very isolating. And if it had happened at a time before the internet, it might have been really, really much more difficult for a lot of people, but particularly, as I say, young people. But her parents are concerned, like you, that she spends now too much time on a screen, and that is her way of communicating. And actually, that was one of the driving forces for them to leave the city and move to the countryside, to give her a greater scope for going and doing other things, for getting out of her bedroom. Now, that's all very simple, but it's still, it can still be very appealing and easy to sit on a screen, even if you've got a lovely garden or a park or a field at the end of your drive. My feeling always, my sort of default for anything is, pretty much everything can be cured or made better by going for a walk, and I think getting children involved and engaged in the natural world in some way, and it's going to depend on their ages and it's going to depend on their interests. But we are enormously lucky in this country, that we've got green spaces. Even our big cities have got fantastic green spaces and fantastic resources, many of them free. And I think it all involves time for parents or grandparents to take children out to those places. I get that, but I think, just as I say, giving kids that access to the outdoors. I filmed a series a few years ago where we had 3 urban families living on a farm in North Wales, and they were there for a month, and it was a series allowing them to understand how food was produced and kind of connecting them to the producers who actually did it. And they immersed themselves in life on the farm, and they were all living in yurts, and so they had no electricity. So all these urban kids turned up with their screens and their tablets and everything else, nowhere to plug them in. And also, they were on a mountain in North Wales, no signal, no 4G, nothing like that. And you know what was so astonishing? Two things that just I will never forget from doing that project. One was that within 24 hours, the whole body language of these children changed, particularly the girls. The girls who had been, you could see sort of screwed up with anxiety, looking at at social media. What am I missing out on? Have I got the right sort of trainers? Is my hair right? All that kind of thing. Suddenly, with that gone, they became kids again. They were building camps and just mucking about in the fields, and their shoulders dropped. You could see there's a whole tension just falling out of their bodies. And we had a filming break in the middle, because a month is a long time for anybody to be filming. And so the families had a 5-day break in the middle where they could all go home. None of them did. They all stayed. And all those young people having that access to being outdoors and the countryside, and for their phones not working, I think every single one of them at the end of it just said, we feel so much happier.
Lovely. The lovely lady's name is Pam. So thank you, Pam, for that question. More questions coming in. Kate, where would you recommend travelling to appreciate the simpler ways of life?
Ooh. Probably not very far, really. Although I say that, some of the journeys that I've been lucky enough to do in the past, it's actually, in a way, it's more the people as ever. Travel is so much about people, and about the people and the communities that you find yourself in, and I'm going to hark back to, again, it was a TV series, but one that I had kind of generated because I'd always been very interested in nomadic people and how they lived, and their often absolutely visceral connection to the environments that they live in, and how often they survive because of their environments and because of their understanding and um, uh, collaboration, if you can put it like that, with their environments. And I went to three places. I lived with three different groups, and uh, they were all memorable in their different ways. But to go to Mongolia and stay with a family in the southern Gobi Desert, and actually we were helped, not just helped. I mean, the whole thing was made possible by an excellent British travel company called Panoramic Journeys, that is run by a woman called Katrina, and she's spent a lot of time in Mongolia. The whole company is now, the sort of Mongolian bit of it is run by Mongolians. So you feel like you're actually properly contributing to local people's livelihoods, but B, you know that you're going to get possibly the most authentic experience that you can. And I went and stayed alongside a family. I mean, there weren't nights that I stayed with the family in their yurts, but you know, no one wants a total stranger sleeping on their bedroom floor with them for weeks on end. So I actually, with our tiny crew, there was only three of us. We camped sort of a little bit down the valley just to give them a bit of breathing space every now and then. But it was such an incredible experience to be with these people who live in an indescribably harsh environment, and yet have this relationship with their livestock. They understand the weather, they know where to find water, they know how to they don't waste anything. I think that was the greatest lesson I learned. Nothing is thrown away, everything is used and reused or repurposed. And so, as I say, Mongolia and spending time with the nomads in the Gobi Desert was a fantastic lesson. Similarly, the Nanettes, the reindeer herders in Siberia, I was there in the depths of winter. The coldest day we had was -54, which is so cold you can't. Everything freezes. Your all your nasal passages freeze. Everything, and there were these astonishing people again who didn't just survive. It wasn't a destitute existence by any means. They were living successfully, and they lived in they call them chums, but basically it looks like a teepee. It's made of reindeer skin and larch wood. Those are two materials that they can get. They ate reindeer and they ate fish and they cut wood when they went to a place where there was wood. They dressed in reindeer hide. Everything they needed, they used and knew how to use. And again, the kind of lessons I had from just being with people who are so thoroughly practical, put me to shame. Someone who can barely sew a button on, but B, was a real privilege. It's a real privilege to learn from people like that.
Yeah, it's fantastic lessons learned. I for your for this book, you've been to the Netherlands to have a look at what's going on there, particularly in the way of things being a circular economy rather than a linear economy, and to think
Mm.
about, rather than buying things new, how about we repair some old things?
Absolutely. Well, the reason that I went to the Netherlands in the first place was down to a woman called Martine Posma, and I'd never heard of her before, but I was on a flight. Uh, this was about 3 or 4 years ago. I was on my way to Borneo, to Malaysian Borneo, which I have to say it had been a long held dream to go there. I was going to an extraordinary area called Daramakot, which is a piece of forest, and one of the places that is supposed to be one of the best places to try and see clouded leopard, which has long been on my wish list. Anyway, while I was on the plane, I was reading a local newspaper, which makes it sound like I'm fluent in Malaysian, but it was an English language Malaysian newspaper, and it happened to mention something about a cafe that had just opened in Kuala Lumpur, and it was a cafe where you could go and take items of clothing or electronic goods or anything you had that was broken and get it fixed. And I thought, gosh, this is an amazing idea. How brilliant. And just sort of, it's one of those things. I just ripped out the bit of newspaper and kind of tucked it. I have a book full of, stuff like that. And it kind of came back to me, this idea of repair cafes. And so I did a bit of kind of research, and it turned out it was started by this Dutch woman called Martina Posma. And so I contacted her and said, could I please come to Amsterdam and interview you? And she came back and she said, no, you can't. And I said, oh, why not? She said, well, can you just interview me online, because I don't want you to fly here. And of course, I had just automatically thought, oh, I'll just, I can jump on a plane from Bristol Airport and hop over. I could probably go in a day. And I said, so I went back to her and I said, if I don't fly, if I come by train, I said, I know it sounds ridiculous, but when I interview somebody, I like to see them in their space. I like to kind of understand their context. And I'd love to come to the first repair cafe that you started in Amsterdam. And she said, okay, if you promise me you don't fly. So I then had to investigate how I got to Amsterdam by not flying from Wales. And actually, the train was really easy. Yes, it took a bit longer, but it was so much more. It was it felt like a proper journey. You get on a plane, and we all know. I'm really torn about flying because I know the environmental impact, but I love traveling, and so I try and counterbalance the wish to fly by hopefully being more sensitive in other areas of my, more economically, environmentally aware in other areas of my life. But nonetheless, actually being kind of forced to look at an alternative was a really, really good lesson. And the lesson in itself was actually take a train or go there a slower way. And there's real pleasure in that. Go there in a simpler way, dare we say it, and there's real pleasure in that. And I arrived right in the centre of Amsterdam, and I booked myself a place to stay that was half an hour's walk from the station. And so I walked there, and then they rented bikes, so I got on my bike and I cycled everywhere. I didn't take a form of fossil fuel transport at all. You don't need to in Amsterdam, but I didn't. And I went to see Martina, and she was such an inspiration, and the repair cafe idea that she came up with, and she came up with it as a response to how wasteful we have become as a society. And as you say, we have been living with a linear economy for a very long time. And a linear economy basically depends on taking raw materials, making them into something, when they break, throwing them away, so that you have this constant thing of producing things, taking resources and producing and then throwing them away and starting all over again. But actually, as well as that, when you describe it in that way, it feels wicked, but it is totally unsustainable. There will be a day where we don't have those resources anymore, and we don't need them. We don't need to keep ripping things out of the ground or cutting things down. We've got so much waste. Some of the figures that I came up with when I was researching the book, the hundreds of thousands of tons of furniture we throw into landfill every year, useful stuff that people need. And so meeting Martina was a real eye-opener into actually we could live differently. And it wouldn't be a huge change for us to stop just throwing things away the minute they break and just clicking on a mouse and getting another one and thinking about getting them fixed. And I think the Repair Shop program on BBC, which has proved so popular. And yes, it's a lovely program because essentially it's great human interest stories, but I think it does chime with a lot of us. And, we've got repair cafes all over the UK now. And I think at last count, there are over 10,000 worldwide because of what Martina started, literally just as an experiment. And if anyone is interested in starting their own repair cafe, you can go onto her website and there's all the kind of information on how to do it. But it is a brilliant start into how we can all bring a little bit of simplicity and real pleasure and sustainability into our lives without it being a kind of major mission.
You look at lots of projects like this. There's so much that we're not going to be able to cover in this conversation that's in the book. I'm thinking men's sheds. I'm thinking what's going on in Frome, for example, in terms of social connectedness and so on. But I want to talk about your sewing, Kate, because you've already intimated that you can't sew on a button. But actually, one of the things that you've looked at over the writing of the book is, well, actually, can I push myself out of the comfort zone with the sewing?
Yes, so I've always felt a little bit pathetic about not being able to sew, and it is also it's become a bit of a kind of a kind of mental block. And I think it started at school in terrible needlework lessons. And, we had to make a skirt, and I literally made the ugliest skirt anyone has ever seen. And it sort of scarred me for life. And I thought, well, that's it. I'm just never going to sew again. And then when I was sort of doing the research for the book, and I was talking to a great local friend of mine, and she said, "Oh, you should have a chat to a friend of mine in Carmarthenshire called Camille." Who she's French, and she trained to be a designer, a fashion designer. She worked for Alexander McQueen, and she's now living in the depths of West Wales. And she said, "I'm not going to tell you anymore. Go and find out her story. I'm not going to tell you anymore either, because you can just read the book." But I went to see her, and she said, "I promise you, I can teach you to sew." And I turned up at her house, and she has sewing groups. She gets people together, and she teaches them how to sew. But actually, it's just a wonderful means of people being together and talking and sharing. And it was the most lovely afternoon. I had this slight feeling that I was in a kind of Jane Austen novel, where you have everybody sort of sitting around doing crochet and talking about Mr. Darcy. It was a little bit like that, except that we didn't talk about Mr. Darcy. And she'd said to me, "Bring something along with you that you want to fix or make." And so I brought with me one of my favorite jumpers. I'm going to so there it is. It's very posh. It's cashmere. I don't have very much cashmere, but this one, and I've had it for a very, very long time. And as I say, I absolutely love it because it's got cactuses on, which make me smile. Anyway, the moth got at it. And so it had 3 holes in the back. And Camille's, and I said, "I just don't know how to do this, and it's going to, it's just going to unravel." And she said, "No, I can show you how to fix them. But not only that, I suggest that you fix them in a way that makes them a little piece of art and makes your jumper unique to you. And so she showed me a stitch. Now, anyone out there who sews beautifully is going to be fairly horrified by my stitching, but nonetheless, she showed me a stitch that would edge the hole so it didn't unravel, and said choose colours that go with the pattern. So just to remind you, there's the cactus on the front, and then here are my repaired, can you see that, moth holes on the back that look like little flowers. And it's, it's made me love this jumper even more, and partly because it, not only because it's unique now, but also it just reminds me of a really lovely afternoon with a bunch of fantastic women, and Camille in the middle of it, shining and delighted that we were all getting so much pleasure from doing something that she loves.
I wonder whether you'd hold up the cover of your book and also show us the beautiful end pages, because it strikes me that I think it's pronounced Kintsugi on the pottery is exactly the same, really, isn't it? The same principle as what you've been talking about in terms of the sewing.
Well, there's a story behind the Kintsugi, because if my husband were here now, he would say that I am literally the most impossible person to live with when I'm writing. I'm completely vile. And so I have to take myself away from polite society and I just disappear, become a monster, I grow a beard, and to write this book, I went to a tiny cabin in West Wales that belonged to a couple of artists. He was a potter and she did kintsugi. And I didn't know what kintsugi was, but it's a way of repairing broken ceramic using a very toxic resin, but then filling in the gaps with gold. And this bowl is a kintsugi bowl, and I actually bought one from her for my publisher. Always bribe your publisher is my top tip, but it's absolutely beautiful. And my publisher said, "But that's the book." And so she then, yes, made the end papers kintsugi like that, and it did completely sort of sum up, I suppose, the essence of what I was trying to explore and then communicate through this book, is that there is great beauty in simplicity and great contentment.
Absolutely. I just want to pick up on a comment that Dawn's put in the chat. I've had health issues, so took a step back and cut down on the hours at work. Now I'm going to Cornwall at the end of June on a walking holiday from Minehead to Westward Ho. Well done, Dawn. That's great. Fantastic. Have a great time. Kate, there's so much that we haven't been able to cover in this book. So many wonderful stories, ideas, and so on. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for signing the books, which are available at the Stanfords stand at the Destination Show. So do go and get a signed copy of this wonderful book. We wish you well, Kate, and happy travelling, happy simplicity.
And to all of you, we can get out there again, and we may feel restricted just being in this country, but it's a very beautiful one. So enjoy wherever you're going.